I am very proud to introduce Arlette Seib.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you for turning out for this unique and wonderful event. It's a privilege to be part of an art exhibit that is women's work, and I'm extra privileged to sort of be standing here to give a presentation, although very nervous about it, but that's okay. We'll get through. I thought I'd just give a quick background. I'm from Saskatchewan, born and raised, and currently live about half hour west of Watrous. My day job is keeping a flock of sheep. And it's quite a large flock, and I'm a felt artist. And the sheep led me to be a felt artist, so that's how I became one. And I'm largely self-taught. The subjects of sheep and dogs and a little bit of the prairie feature pretty heavily in my work. One of the questions I get asked often is, why sheep? Especially from local Saskatchewan people. Sheep aren't that common out here. We're grain and cattle country, so I get asked quite a bit, like, what's the interest with sheep? And really, years ago, we had moved to the farm and we were in a very, very stuck place in agriculture, just trying to decide, where do we go? It's not working, and we knew we weren't doing the right thing with the land. And I had a border collie, and what border collie doesn't love to work some sheep? So I bought 5 sheep for this darn dog. And that just erased all the other agriculture we were doing, and we went into raising sheep. And our land base is entirely returned to grassland. Prairie has become one of our first loves, and that sheep flock has encouraged us to look at how we treat that prairie land and how we can enhance the piece of property that we have. And so that's kind of my background and my day job. And then somewhere along the way, several years into having sheep, I discovered, I believe it was just online, but I discovered you could actually do something with this wool other than just sell it raw. And to me that was like, well, this is just the next piece of the puzzle. Like, I just got to give this a go. And I tried felting, and it was incredibly frustrating. And I did it a little bit, gave it a couple of attempts, and then I quit because it was pretty hard. Previous to felting, I had been doing color pencil work, sort of a realistic style drawings. Dogs, of course, were my main subject. But going to working with fiber was very, very different and challenging. So a couple years after I gave the first attempt, it came back to my mind again, and I thought, you just gotta give her a go, try it again. So I jumped in again, tried it, and then sort of worked out a few of the kinks that I had struggled with early on. And then that's probably been about 6 years now. And so wool is my main medium now. I do return to drawing. I still love to draw, so I do return to drawing and take a break from felting. I'm not sure how many of you know that much about felting, there's 2 types of felting. One is dry and one is wet, depending on what you're doing and what your aim is. But it can become, working with the fiber can become a very, very physical act. It's almost like bread making. If you're wet felting, it's like bread making. You're just going to town on it. So it's a very, very physical release when you're felting, which I do quite enjoy. The other felting, which is done dry, is far more tedious, but it represents a little bit more like drawing, right? So that's kind of how my story of how I wound up being a felt artist, and I would invite any questions if anybody's got any at the moment.
So how long would one of those pieces take exactly, and what is the process from beginning to end?
So one of the sculptural pieces?
Yes.
Yeah, the sculptural pieces, I can usually do one in about 5 to 6 hours. And that's I'm starting with a clean wool. So there's a lot of steps not necessarily included in a felt artist's process. Like if you start with taking the wool off of the sheep, then there's a lot of work. You're getting the wool off the sheep, you're getting it washed, you're getting it cleaned. That all happens before you even begin to think about a piece of artwork. When it comes to actually laying this out and deciding to make a vessel, then it's probably about a 6-7 hour day. Yeah. The process is, it actually starts flat. So if you lay out fibers, if you picture a quilt batting, it's the best visual I can give. If you picture quilt batting, you lay that out in a sheet, and then you lay another layer crossways and another layer and another layer. And then you add soap and water, and you begin just using your hands and you're massaging and massaging and massaging. So you're releasing the air from the fibers, and the fibers are taking up the water and the soap. And as it does that, the wool will begin to entangle. And that is the beauty and the characteristic of wool, is that it wants to felt, it wants to create that mesh. Cotton will not do it, silk will not do it, other fibers won't do it, but wool will. And so you're pushing all the fibers together, they begin to entangle and literally become like a fabric. So you no longer can pull them apart. And the more physical you get with it, and the heavier you start to knead it, and literally you can be throwing it, you can be lifting it up and throwing it down and lifting it up and throwing it down, and it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter all the time. And that's what creates the shape, or that's what creates the thickness to give you shape. When you're toward the end of the process, you begin to decide the shape you're after. If you're going for the bowl, or you're going for something tall, or you want it to remain flat.
So I noticed downstairs you had like the wolves or the other sheep, and how you got the colors to go where you want it to go. That was, I'm like, wow, how did you do that?
That was the frustration when I started with fiber, right? Because it's not it's not a stiff medium like a colored pencil or ink, in your hand, and it's not a fluid medium like paint. It won't run anywhere, right? But it's a piece of fiber. It's just all these tiny little, very, very tiny little strings. And you have a tool called a felting needle. And a felting needle, there's no thread. It's just a needle with little small barbs on the end of it. And that needle just pokes the fibers, the individual fibers, down into another layer of felt. Again, it starts the same way. You have a layer of wool, a layer of wool, a layer of wool. But instead of adding water, I'm just taking that needle and then putting my little blue, green, pink fibers where I want them with that little needle. Yeah, and it's quite tedious. And it can be frustrating because like the fibers can be very flyaway. If you imagine just playing with a little bit of your hair, right, it can be very flyaway. And so it can be quite an effort sometimes to, get them where you want them to go. Yeah.
So the colors that you have in your vases, are they all different pieces that you felted together, or is it one piece that you dyed them somehow? Like the blue, did you dip that somehow, or is that two separate pieces that you meshed together?
No, it's two different products. It's white wool and then a blue wool. So the white wool, like natural wools, are your whites, your grays, your browns, your blacks. There's lots of variety of natural wools. And your colored wool is the white wool that has been dyed, right? So the colored wool is one of the layers that I put on top, right? So if I know that I want, you kind of have to think in a structural mindset. So if you know you're aiming for a vase and you want the top to be a different color than the bottom, when you're laying that out flat, you have to think structurally. My white's going to be at the bottom, my blue's got to be at the top. So that blue wool just becomes one of the layers I lay down.
Okay.
So I lay down the white wool, the blue wool, and then reverse it, the white wool, the blue wool, and keep building the layers,
And
placing the color where you want.
And do you color the wool yourself then?
No, at this point I don't. And the reason I don't, I do some of my own wool processing. So I'm washing the raw wool that I've taken off the sheep and carding it and combing it to get it ready to use. But the dyeing process isn't something I've been able to get into, only because of time, really, right? Like if you imagine if you just imagine a painter or a color pencil artist, but you have to make your own pencil first. That's the equivalent. Or you have to make that pigment for your paint before you can ever paint.
Yeah.
Like that is kind of the process. It's so time consuming. So yeah, I kind of skip that step and buy and barter and trade for the dyed wool. Yeah.
I have a question. As someone who sews, I perceive that you have seams but I don't think you have seams, do you? You actually just work it into a shape, right?
Right, yeah, there's no seams. It's not that there can't be. I know some felt artists do layers of wool, and then they will use needle and thread and create edges and beautiful lines and such. But these pieces, no, there is no seams. So when it's at the end, like you can physically feel the fibers changing from a loose outlay of wool to a tighter and tighter mesh all the time. Of course, as you all know, wool shrinks, right? So that's what it's going to do. As it gets to that point, you're really sort of feeling the fibers. Like you're sort of, what are the fibers doing? Are they ready? Are they not ready? And I've gone through pieces where I thought they were ready and then they just completely fell apart, right? So there is a feeling, like working with the hands, it's a real feeling of where are the fibers at? Are they felted enough? When they're felted enough, then you can begin to shape, right? You can, some of them I will put over like a vase I have at home and I will start to manipulate the shape, right? Or put over whatever item is lying around the house and try and manipulate the shape. And as you manipulate the shape, now you want the water to leave, right? You want to, it's done its felting, so now you're trying to get the water out and you get it, you're just always like rubbing it and shaping it and shaping it and rubbing it. It's very physical. And then you get the shape and you walk away for 2 or 3 days and wait for it to dry. And as it dries, it shrinks up that little bit further and stiffens it up a bit more.
I have another question.
Sure.
So you have your sheep, and you take wool off them all the time. You don't raise them for meat, so they become like your pets. Like you know them all, right?
Not quite,
No?
because I have a lot of sheep.
Okay.
Yeah, so like sheep, that is my day job. So like it's a fairly big job. There are a few hundred of them out there.
I see.
Yeah, and that's shrunk because of these dry years. But so I do have a lot of sheep. And I do raise market lamb as well, right? Because that is part of my income. So the shearing process happens once a year. So all their wool comes off in April. And then I do have some favorite ewes. I select some best, the ones who will present me with the fiber that I like to work with, right? Because some do and some don't. And so those fleeces from those animals, I bag up and they go into my little wool storage spot, right? And then if I'm going to do the washing and everything myself, then I get into that. But if not, I actually send it out to a wool mill and let them do the washing and the carding, and then my lovely wool comes back to me
Great.
ready to go. Yeah.
So you talked about shearing several hundred sheep. Now, I imagine you get help in for that.
That I get help from,
Yeah.
or help for, yes, indeed. Yeah, that's a whole day's job right there. So there's a shearing crew that comes in and does that for us.
My question is, sort of what's next for you? What are you working on?
Right now, my intuition says to take wool to a functional level. So I've done a lot of the 2D works, like a lot of the pictures of the scenes of the sheep and the dogs and flat painting kind of works. I've done a little bit of the vessel work. I want to explore more wool as a functional and useful material, because essentially, like, it's, if you think of how old it is, how sustainable it is, and how long lasting it is, I want those aspects to really come through now. So I want to lean into more like big rugs, hand making wool rugs, and then a little bit more, play a lot more with the structural felt and see, where can that go. Yeah. And then in terms of becoming a little bit more experienced with felting and sort of having gone through several years of frustration and learning and eagerness and anticipation, I do feel in the future there's area for workshops and just inviting people out to the place to be able to see, from the fiber, from the land to the animal to the creative arts. I think there's a real connection and need, I think, for that, just for people to be aware of, how sustainable that we can make this whole process. So.
Your two-dimensional works, do you work off your photographs? Arlette is a beautiful photographer. You should follow her on Instagram. She's got some
Nice.
gorgeous photos of her sheep. Do you work off your photos?
Thank you, Allison. Yes, I do. I take a tremendous amount of photography. I think because I live very rural and I do live like a fairly solid life of solitude. So the camera and my land and my critters are kind of my world. And I am out there all the time with that camera to snap sort of images and pictures and try to share that with others. So my photographs usually on my computer, and yeah, usually one pops up now and again. It's like, that'll work as a felting. And then yeah, I just go from there and just keep that photo up on my iPad or whatever and yeah, go from there.
Do you have other animals besides sheep?
I do. Oh, I've got a couple cows, a couple horses, lots of dogs, and a couple cats round it all off.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arlette. I appreciate you being here tonight.
All right. Thank you.